The carriage wheels crunched over the damp gravel, the sound sharp and final in the quiet English afternoon. Inside, Levvenia Cressida Fairchild smoothed the lace trim of her ivory day dress for the 10th time. Her slender hands trembled ever so slightly. "Stop fidgeting, my lady," Mara said from the seat opposite her. Mara Wren had been Levvenia's companion since girlhood on the Fairchild estates, and she was the only person in the world allowed to speak to a baron's daughter with such bluntness. "You look radiant. You always look radiant." Hey there, lovely listeners. If my cheeky nephew hears we've hit 1,000 subscribers, he promises to finally stop hiding my story notes and even read one aloud in his terrible dramatic voice. So wherever you're tuning in from, cozy London flat, rainy countryside cottage, or sunny overseas balcony, drop a comment telling me your spot. Smash that like button if this Regency heart tugger has you hooked already, and subscribe so we can keep flooding your feeds with more swooning, child-filled happily ever afters. Your support literally makes these tales possible. "I feel like a rare orchid being delivered to auction," Levvenia confessed, gazing out the window at the gray stone expanse of Ashenir Manor rising through the mist-shrouded oaks. "A month-long trial to see if we suit. It feels medieval, Mara." "It is sensible," Mara replied, leaning forward, her dark eyes keen, "and it is far kinder than the alternative." The alternative lingered unspoken between them. "Gideon—" "Do not speak his name," Levvenia whispered, though Mara had not spoken it. "I didn't need to," Mara said gently. "But look at this place, Levvenia. It is enduring. It is secure. Let us just hope this Baron Fairchild is not like Gideon, all charming smiles, tailored coats, and a soul as cold as winter iron." "The Baron is a widower," Levvenia said, raising her chin. "He has known love before. That proves he can feel it. Gideon loved only his own reflection. We shall see." The carriage lurched to a halt. Levvenia drew a steadying breath. "Courage," she murmured to herself. "You are Levvenia Cressida Fairchild. You have endured scandal and society's whispers. You can endure an English baron." The footman opened the door. Levvenia stepped out, expecting a reception. She expected the baron standing on the steps, perhaps a regimented line of staff, a formal bow. Instead, she found bedlam. A heavy trunk was sitting haphazardly on the bottom step, looking as if it had been thrown there. The front door stood wide open, and a woman in a severe bonnet, the governess presumably, stormed past Levvenia without a word, her face flushed with frustration. Behind her, in the cavernous doorway, there was no baron to be seen. There were only 3 small, motherless children watching her with wide, unguarded eyes. The governess disappeared into a waiting hired coach, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence in her wake. Levvenia stood on the stone steps, the cool, damp air clinging to her skin, while the heavy oak door remained open behind her. A breathless housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, finally emerged from the shadows, wringing her apron in distress. "Oh, my lady, what a disaster!" the woman gasped, her cap askew. "The Baron is away in London on urgent estate matters. He did not expect you until the week's end, and now Miss Pringle has just abandoned us." Levvenia looked past the flustered woman into the dim cavern of the grand hall. The 3 figures she had glimpsed earlier remained fixed in place. The eldest, a boy of about 11 with tousled dark brown hair, stepped forward protectively. This was Jasper. His brown eyes held a gravity far beyond his years, watching her not with welcome, but with the sharp, unblinking suspicion of a sentry guarding a fortress. Beside him, a girl with soft, light brown curls, Elowen, tilted her head, her bright green eyes tracking the movement of the wind in Levvenia's skirts with unmasked curiosity. Clinging to Elowen's sleeve was the youngest, Lysander. He looked no older than 8, his fair hair neatly combed, his wide blue eyes filled with innocent alarm. "We have no one to manage them tonight, my lady," Mrs. Gable lamented, lowering her voice. Perhaps you should return to the village inn until Lord Fairchild returns." Levvenia looked at the children again. She saw the stiffness in Jasper's shoulders and the way Lysander trembled. She remembered the sharp, cold loneliness of her own childhood nursery. "No," Levvenia said softly, surprising herself. She turned to Mara, who nodded in silent agreement. "I shall stay. Someone must ensure they are fed." Dinner was a quiet affair, served in a dining room that felt far too large for 4 people. The heavy velvet drapes were drawn against the rain, and the only sound was the clinking of silver against china. Levvenia did not force conversation, nor did she scold them for their elbows on the table. She simply ate, acutely aware of their scrutiny. "Your hair is like copper," Eowyn whispered suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. "Does it burn?" Jasper kicked his sister under the table, his face reddening. "Don't be rude." "It does not burn," Levvenia smiled, unconsciously touching a loose auburn tendril that had escaped her pins, "but it has a temper of its own in the rain." Lysander giggled, a tiny fracturing sound, before clapping a hand over his mouth. For the first time, the air in the manor felt less like a tomb and more like a held breath. Later that night, Levvenia sat by the dying fire in her guest suite, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Gideon had called her decorative. The Baron was absent. She felt like an intruder in a house of ghosts. A soft scratch at the threshold drew her attention. She opened the heavy door to an empty, drafty hallway. Lying on the floorboards was a single, slightly wilted dandelion. Levvenia picked it up, twirling the fragile stem. It was a peace offering, or perhaps a test. As the candle flickered, she wondered, could these wary children ever truly let her in, or would they eventually drive her away like everyone else before, leaving her more broken than she was when she arrived? The heavens opened the following morning and refused to close. For 3 days, Ashenir was besieged by gray water, trapping them within its thick stone walls. Yet where Levvenia had expected the stifling air of cabin fever, she found a strange, quiet rhythm beginning to take root in the nursery. She sat by the roaring hearth, the warmth of the fire battling the damp chill seeping through the window panes. Eowyn was settled on the rug between her knees, finally still. "You must hold your head steady," Levvenia murmured, drawing the silver-backed brush through the girl's unruly light brown curls. With the garden inaccessible, Levvenia had improvised, weaving dried lavender and statice taken from the mantelpiece vases into the girl's braids. "There," Levvenia whispered, fastening the end of the plait. "A crown for the Queen of the Meadow." Eowyn spun around, her green eyes wide and shining as she touched the makeshift flower crown. "Does a queen have to eat porridge?" "Especially porridge," Levvenia replied with a soft laugh. A sudden crack of thunder shook the room, rattling the sash windows in their frames. Lysander, who had been building a fortress of wooden blocks, flinched violently and dropped his face into his hands. Levvenia didn't hesitate. She reached out, pulling the trembling boy onto the velvet settee beside her and wrapping a heavy wool throw around his shoulders. "The thunder is merely the clouds moving their furniture," she whispered, smoothing his fair hair. It was a silly lie her own nanny had told her once, in a nursery far colder and lonelier than this one. She remembered the ache of being left alone in the dark, wishing for a hand to hold. She would not let Lysander feel that chill. Across the room, Jasper sat in the window seat, a Latin primer open on his knees. He had been ostensibly reading for an hour, but Levvenia noticed the page had not turned. He was watching them, watching her hand resting on Lysander's shoulder, watching Eowyn preen with her flowers. When Levvenia caught his gaze, the boy did not glare or look away. Instead, he offered a stiff, awkward nod, a crack in the ice. A dangerous warmth bloomed in Levvenia's chest. In her father's house, and later with Gideon, she had been an ornament, something to be polished, admired, and put away. Here, amidst the scent of wood smoke and damp wool, she felt the terrifying tug of attachment. She was beginning to feel necessary. Just as the fragile silence settled into something resembling peace, a sound cut through the drumming of the rain. It was the heavy, rhythmic pounding of hooves on gravel, followed by the distinct screech of carriage wheels braking on the wet drive. Jasper leaped from the window seat, his book thumping to the floor. "Father?" Levvenia's heart hammered against her ribs. She moved to the window, peering through the mist. Below, a carriage door swung open, a tall man, dark-haired and broad-shouldered, looking up at the house with intensity. But he did not turn to the stairs immediately. He turned back to the carriage and offered his hand to someone else, a silhouette of severe posture and stiff skirts. Roderick had returned early, and he had not come alone. Lord Roderick Fairchild filled the doorway, his presence imposing, even as he shook the heavy rainwater from his greatcoat. The Manor, usually a cavern of echoing silence or childish squabbles upon his return, was unnervingly warm. A fire crackled in the grate, and the scent of dried lavender lingered in the air. Beside him stood his aunt, Lady Constance, a woman whose spine appeared to be made of the same unforgiving iron as the manor gates. She surveyed the scene, the children standing in a neat row, Elowen's hair still adorned with the dried flowers, and pursed her lips in immediate disapproval. "Hardly appropriate attire for the drawing-room," Lady Constance sniffed, her gaze landing sharply on Elowen. "And look at Lysander. He is clinging to his sister like an infant. It seems the discipline here has eroded entirely in my absence." The children shrank back, old habits of fear returning instantly. Jasper's fists clenched at his sides, his eyes darting to his father. Roderick opened his mouth, exhaustion lining his features, but a calm, clear voice cut through the tension before he could speak. "On the contrary, Lady Constance," Levvenia said, stepping forward from the shadows of the hearth. She moved with a fluid grace that drew every eye in the room. "The children have been exemplary. Elowen's flowers are a testament to her creativity, and Lysander's closeness to his sister shows a loyalty we should all aspire to emulate." Silence stretched tight across the room. Roderick's head snapped toward Levvenia. He had expected a shrinking Violet, a woman cowed by his abrupt departure and the chaos he had left behind. Instead, he found a woman who stood between his children and the world like a shield of ivory and steel. During tea, the tension remained palpable, but the dynamic had shifted. Whenever Lady Constance prepared another barb, Levvenia deflected it with polite, impenetrable conversation. Roderick said little, but his dark eyes followed Lavinia's hands as she poured the tea, steady, capable, and gentle. When she passed him his cup, their fingers brushed. The contact sent a jolt through him that he hadn't felt in years, a sudden awakening of nerves he thought dead. He looked up, catching her gaze, and for a moment the room fell away. His look was intense, searching, and dangerously warm. Lavinia's heart stuttered, but she quickly lowered her eyes, her pulse thrumming with a treacherous hope. Yet, as she retreated to her chair, the cold whisper of doubt returned. Was that heat in his eyes for her, or was he simply relieved to find a competent caretaker for his burdens? Gideon had looked at her with possession. Roderick looked at her with need. She wasn't sure which was more dangerous. If this quiet moment of hope has your heart racing, don't risk missing what happens next. Subscribe now before the storm of doubt hits. Those who skip might find themselves commenting below in regret. "I unsubscribed and now I'm lost forever." The storm finally broke, leaving the Ashenir gardens awash in a vibrant, tearful green. The air smelled of wet earth and new blooms as Levvenia walked beside Roderick along the winding gravel path. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, awkward quiet of strangers, but the companionable peace of two souls moving in rhythm. Roderick paused beside a sprawling, unruly rosebush, his fingers hesitating over a thorn. "Catherine planted these," he said, his voice low and rough, like stone grinding on stone. After she died, I let the weeds take them. I suppose I thought if she was gone, the beauty should go too. I did not want to be reminded of what could bloom." Levvenia watched his profile, seeing the deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes. "Grief is a selfish gardener, my lord," she said softly. "It chokes everything it touches if you let it." She looked down at her hands. "My former betrothed, he preferred his flowers cut and placed in a vase. He wanted them beautiful, silent, and strictly decorative. He found no value in roots that might grow messy or wild." Roderick turned to her fully then, the intensity of his gaze stopping her breath. He stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that felt entirely necessary. "Then he was a fool," Roderick said firmly. "You are not a decoration, Levvenia. You are the sun that has brought this frozen house back to life. You have done what I could not." He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before resting gently on her gloved arm. The contact sent a tremor through her. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between them, the gray of his eyes, the flush of her skin, the undeniable pull of a second chance. Suddenly, a shriek of delighted laughter shattered the moment. Lysander burst from the hedging, his fair hair flying, with Jasper in close pursuit, laughing openly for the first time in months. Elowyn wove between them, crowning her father with a chain of daisies she had woven. Roderick looked down at his children, then back at Levvenia, a genuine smile breaking across his face. In the golden afternoon light, they looked like a family. Buoyed by this new fragility, they attended the village assembly that evening, a rare venture into society. The hall was warm, filled with fiddle music and rustic joy. Levvenia felt safe, anchored by Roderick's presence at her side. But as the crowd parted near the punch bowl, the air in her lungs turned to ice. Leaning against a pillar, watching her with predatory amusement, was a figure from her nightmares. Gideon straightened his silk cravat, a familiar, cruel smile curling his lips. He had come to reclaim what he had discarded, and as his eyes met hers, Levvenia knew the peace of Ashenir was about to be shattered. The fiddle music swirled around the crowded assembly hall, but Levvenia heard only the steady, comforting beat of her own heart. Roderick danced, not with the rote, bored precision of the London dandy she was accustomed to, but with a grounded strength that made her feel entirely held. His hand on her waist was warm and firm, and as they turned in the country dance, his eyes locked with hers. For the first time, Levvenia allowed herself to imagine that this was not a trial, but a beginning. "You look happy," Roderick murmured, his voice dipping low enough to vibrate in her chest. "I am," she breathed, the admission terrifying and sweet. The spell shattered with the intrusion of a polished black boot and a voice like silk wrapped around a blade. "Charming," the voice drawled. "I see the leftovers finding such rustic use." The music seemed to screech to a halt. Levvenia froze, the blood draining from her face as she turned to find Gideon standing there. He was flanked by his London sycophants, looking at Roderick with mocking pity. "Be careful, Baron," Gideon said, his voice carrying clearly over the sudden hush of the room. "She breaks easily. That is why I returned her. One prefers a bride who is whole, not one cracked by desperation." Levvenia trembled, waiting for Roderick to strike him, to defend her honor. Instead, she felt Roderick stiffen. He looked from Gideon's tailored perfection to Levvenia's stricken, pale face. In her silence, he did not see shock. He saw regret. His old insecurity, the gnawing fear that he was merely a convenient safe harbor for a woman who truly desired another, bled anew. He stepped back, dropping her hand as if it burned. His face closed like a shuttered window, the warmth vanishing instantly. I see, Roderick said, his voice unrecognizable. I shall not interrupt your reunion. He turned on his heel and walked out into the night, leaving her alone in the center of the whispering crowd, the humiliation burning her skin like acid. The ride back to Ashenir was suffocatingly silent. Roderick rode ahead on horseback, refusing to look at the carriage. By the time dawn broke, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gray, Levvenia had made her choice. She would not wait to be asked to leave. She would not endure the pity of a man who thought she was still pining for a monster. She folded her ivory dress into her trunk, her hand steady with the numbness of resignation. She latched the lid with a final hollow click. But when she opened her bedroom door, dragging her heavy burden behind her, the hallway was not empty. 3 small figures in white night rails blocked her path, their eyes wide and knowing. "Please don't go," Aloan's voice was a ragged whisper, her small hand clutching the hem of Levvenia's traveling cloak. Jasper stood silently, his jaw set in a mimicry of his father's stubbornness, while Lysander simply wept, his face buried in Aloan's shoulder. Levvenia felt her heart fracture. She knelt on the floorboards, ignoring the trunk that stood like a coffin between them, and smoothed Aloan's curls one last time. "I must, dearest. Sometimes grown-ups make messes that cannot be tidied away with stories or flower crowns." She kissed their foreheads, a benediction of sorrow, and forced herself to stand. Stepping around them felt like walking through broken glass, but she could not stay in a house where the master believed she belonged to another. Minutes later, the carriage lurched into motion. Inside, Levvenia sat rigid, refusing to look back at the gray stone walls of Ashenir. Roderick stood at the library window, watching the carriage recede into the mist. He expected relief, safety from the agonizing risk of loving and losing again. Instead, the house roared with the silence of her absence, punctuated only by the muffled, devastating sobbing drifting down from the nursery. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He was not protecting his heart, he was entombing it. Gideon had broken her trust, but Roderick was breaking her spirit. "Saddle the stallion," he shouted, startling the footman in the hall. "Now!" He didn't wait for a coat. He rode like a man possessed, the wind biting at his face, the clouds bursting open to drench the road in a sudden, violent downpour. He caught the carriage near the old stone bridge, cutting across its path and forcing the horses to a rearing halt. He tore the carriage door open. Levvenia sat inside, pale and startled. "Roderick?" "I am a coward," he shouted over the drumming rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, water dripping from his nose. "I saw him look at you, and I remembered the pain of losing Catherine, and I was terrified. I thought you looked at him with regret, but if I let you leave, I will regret it for every hour of the rest of my life." "I never wanted him," Levvenia cried, stepping out into the mud and rain to meet him, heedless of her dress. "I only wanted to be seen by you." He pulled her into his arms, wet and trembling, burying his face in her neck. "Stay," he begged, his voice breaking. "Not for the children, for me. Marry me, Levvenia." As they turned back toward Ashenir, the manor lights glowed through the storm like a warm promise, but as the carriage approached the drive, Levvenia wondered if the children, abandoned twice in one morning, would forgive the adults so easily. The carriage had barely ceased its motion before the heavy oak doors flew open. There was no hesitation this time, no guarded sentries waiting in the shadows. Jasper, Eloan, and Lysander tumbled out into the drizzle, heedless of the mud splashing their nightclothes. Levvenia stepped down, not as a guest on trial, but as a woman returning home. Lysander hit her skirts first, sobbing with relief, followed by Eloan's fierce, trembling embrace. Even Jasper, usually so stoic, buried his face in his father's wet coat. "We came back," Roderick promised, his hand finding Levvenia's over the children's heads, interlacing their fingers tightly. "We will always come back." The forgiveness was not spoken in words, but in the fierce grip of small hands and the collective sigh of a household finally exhaling its grief. Weeks later, the garden chapel, once overgrown and forgotten, stood adorned with white roses and wild ivy. The ceremony was intimate, the air filled with the scent of late summer blooms. When Roderick slipped the gold band onto Levvenia's finger, his hands were steady. The vows they whispered were not merely promises of fidelity, but a covenant to shelter the 3 small witnesses standing beside them. It was not just a union of 2 hearts, but the welding of 5 into something unbreakable. 1 year later, the winter frost clung to the nursery window panes, creating patterns of silver lace, but the room within was ablaze with warmth. Levvenia sat in the velvet rocking chair, her silhouette changed, the gentle, proud curve of her belly hinting at the new life arriving with the spring. Elowen sat between her knees on the rug, humming a soft tune as Levvenia pulled the silver-backed brush through the girl's curls. The rhythm was soothing, a ritual that had healed them both.
"Will the baby have hair like mine?" Elowen asked, tilting her head back. "Perhaps," Levvenia smiled, resting a hand on her stomach where a small flutter answered her. "Or perhaps like your father's. As long as they have your spirit, I shall be content." Roderick stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching them. The silence of the manor was no longer a tomb, but a vessel for peace. He watched the firelight dance on Levvenia's copper hair and his daughter's trusting face. The shadows that had once haunted Ashenir had been chased away entirely, replaced by the chaotic, noisy, magnificent mess of love. He crossed the room, kissing the top of Levvenia's head, finally truly home. If this perfect, happy ending has warmed your soul, imagine losing access to more tales like this. Subscribe right now before you close the tab and spend forever wondering, what if I had stayed? Those who won't, head to comments and spill why you're choosing heartbreak over happily ever after. Educational value. Beyond the romance and the rain-swept chases, the tale of Ashenir Manor offers quiet, profound lessons on the resilience of the human heart. Foremost is the truth that grief cannot be hurried or commanded, it must be thawed. Levvenia's journey demonstrates that consistent kindness, manifested in small daily rituals like flower crown making and fireside stories, builds trust far more effectively than authority ever could. The story reveals that children, like the guarded Jasper or fearful Lysander, often mask their pain with silence or rebellion, requiring emotional safety rather than strict discipline to heal. Furthermore, the narrative explores the immense courage required for vulnerability. Both Roderick and Levvenia had to unlearn the scars of their pasts, his terror of loss and her deep-seated fear of being merely decorative. Their arc teaches that true strength lies not in walling off one's heart to avoid pain, but in the bravery to expose it despite the risk. Finally, the sharp contrast between Gideon's vanity and Roderick's devotion serves as a reminder that love is not about finding a reflection of oneself, but about nurturing the wild, messy growth of another. Ultimately, Ashenir teaches that family is not always born of blood. It is forged through the deliberate, terrifying, and beautiful choice to stay when running away would be easier.